Our next speaker is Dr. Leslie Roche with the University of California, Davis.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the California context, building climate resilience across California's working rangelands. And just a shout out to my co-authors, Grace Woodmansey, Dan Macon, Tracy Shore, and Kate Munden Dixon. They've been working with me as well as many collaborators over the last 10 years kind of on this work that I'm going to present today. And we're coming at this from the perspective of we're all within UC Cooperative Extension within California, working with stakeholders. So I guess that's our lens. So give a little bit of the California context. California is the largest and most diverse agricultural economy in the nation, with revenue from farms and ranches exceeding $50 billion from over, I believe, 400 different commodities now. Our landscape also includes 34 million acres of rangelands that support diverse ecological and socioeconomic resources. These lands include some of the world's major biodiversity hotspots. They encompass watersheds for nearly all the state's surface waters and support a $3 billion plus livestock ranching industry. So given the scale of production in the state, sustainable agriculture is vital to the economic and environmental security of not just the state, but also the nation. And of course, as we all know, and as we've been talking today already, there are current and future climate risks that are posing many challenges to this. So we have increased frequency and intensity of extreme events such as extreme heat, drought, flood, wildfire, pests and disease pressures, and they're already significantly impacting agriculture and the broader economy. And these conditions, unfortunately, are only providing a glimpse of the future. Within California, our farmers and ranchers are under constant pressure to adjust to these uncertain weather and climate events. And these challenges, as we all know, they are multidimensional and they are wicked problems. Climate change and weather extremes specifically threaten California's rangelands, which are largely rainfall dependent and therefore greatly vulnerable to extreme hazards like drought. The impact of drought on the rangeland economy is the most devastating climate-linked event for our ranching communities. And drought, within California has really played a formative role in the state's early history and has continued to impact the state with 6, I think maybe even more now, multi-year droughts just since 1960. Here you can see this was our historic drought from 2012 through 2016 that we just experienced. So coping with and adapting to drought is critical to the sustainability of these operations. And so coordinated efforts are really needed to develop novel tools and novel strategies to support transformational changes or to support climate smart agriculture, if you will. And this really needs to be done directly in collaboration with stakeholders on the ground. And with most of these stakeholders being multi-generational, I've done a lot of work over the years. Most of these folks, 3/4 or more are 3rd generation or more. There's a lot of knowledge here to work with, as Haley actually just talked about. And so the framework that I'm kind of operating with is yet another RAD framework. It's the Rangeland Adaptive Decision-Making Framework. With really showing that land managers are they're making decisions and they're adjusting strategies for multiple outcomes across scales within the context of social ecological system within which their operation is embedded, and really emphasizes how the sustainability of ranching operations depends on their abilities to respond over time to the changing social ecological system. And so this is what we've been looking at, and thinking about how the interlinkages between the social and ecological systems. So based on this framework, I'll draw on over 10 years of survey and interview data that we've been collecting in collaboration with the ranching community and the rangeland management community to highlight lessons learned, around responding to transformational changes that have threatened ecosystems and livelihoods. And of course, with a special focus on drought, because that has been a major driver for us in California, and as well as many other rangelands, of course. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of the baseline work that we did with cattle producers and the rancher decision making survey way back in 2011. And then some follow-up interviews that we did with both beef and sheep producers during the heart of our 2012 through 2016 historic drought. And then I'll wrap up with some of the interviews that we did with a new generation of ranchers here in California. So back in 2011, we worked with California Cattlemen's Association to survey over 500 California beef producers to kind of get a general picture of factors affecting rancher decision making in terms of getting better understanding of resource networks, operator values, management capacity, et cetera. And we had a specific focus in there on rangeland drought, and really kind of couching the conversation of climate change within that. And so the objectives specifically with regard to coping with rangeland drought were to look at the types of drought strategies that were in place across California's rangelands, and to examine how individual drought adaptation is enhanced by specific decision-making factors. And so I'll give you a little bit of a kind of, what we saw as baseline. So, in terms of, what are the typical management responses to weather changes? What are those incremental adaptations that folks, were already making? And so we asked about what we termed proactive practices, or practices that were put in place to prepare for a potential drought. And the most utilized practices here, they all revolved, the primary tools revolved around conserving forage and actively managing risk. So doing things like employing conservative stocking rates or incorporating pasture rest into the system. We also asked about those, classical reactive practices. What are things that folks do to respond to a current drought? And, among the most utilized practices here in bold, the primary tools revolved around managing impact to their bottom line. So immediately reducing herd size, purchasing feed to maintain that core herd. Also doing things like looking into or accessing government assistance programs. So those were, the commonly used kind of same base practices across all operators. And we had about, I think there were 7 different proactive and reactive practices that were, kind of most popular or most utilized. And so kind of the next natural question was, well, is everybody just kind of doing, everything the same? They're adopting the same strategies in the same ways, or, how are people putting practices together to form an overall strategy? Is there variability across operations? And so based on individual responses to those practice questions, we statistically identified classes of drought strategies in place across California's rangelands. And what we found was that there were 4 types of on-ranch drought strategies, kind of these really broad classes that spanned a gradient of increasing management intensity. And by intensity, I mean basically spanned a gradient of the number and types of drought practices that were adopted by each of these classes. And to give you kind of a picture of that, as we move from left to right across the board, you can see we see an increasing number of practices that are adopted by each class, ranging from these dark blue reactive practices, drought practices, increasing numbers as we move across, to a greater integration of both reactive and proactive, which is underlined here in gray, practices as we get to the right-hand side of the board here. And so, to summarize, low adoption rates on the left side of mainly reactive practices to higher adoption rates of both reactive and proactive practices here on the right side. We also looked at background operation variables that might be driving strategy selection. And, not surprisingly, just comparing the left and right hand sides of the board, class 1 here was, had very low adoption rates of these drought management practices. Basically, the only thing they all had in common was they were just purchasing feed to kind of keep the herd going. These tended to be smaller operations with not a lot of resources. In contrast, classes like, classes 3 and 4, which had a larger number of practices, increasing emphasis on proactive practices, these tended to be larger operations with access to more resources. For example, they had different land types within their operation and gave them more flexibility within their decision making. So when we're thinking about, I'm terming transformative adaptation at the ranch level, this can look very different for each of these types of operations. So that's looking at, the sort of the basic structuring variables and what are the types of drought strategies that kind of constrain the universe of opportunities for folks across the state. We wanted to dig into that, that RAD framework and really look at how can we enhance drought adaptation capacity at the individual level and really understand the factors that are potentially driving individual adaptive capacity or drought adaptation in this case. And we defined drought adaptation as the number. We had multiple indicators here: number of drought practices used, which was really important in structuring those types of strategies that I just showed, as well as having an active drought management plan in place. And so what we found was when we looked at the linkages between these different indicators, basically the take home is we found that increasing information sharing, flexibility of resources, having that large toolbox of practices at their disposal, and then also resource valuation or goal setting. So, thinking about valuing those future forage resources or supporting goals like soil health, like the plant community and weed resistance. These all had positive influences and were important in building adaptive capacity. So that's all what we learned kind of in that baseline work that we did with about 500 ranchers across California back in 2011. Following the historic statewide drought that gripped California between 2012 and 2016, we went back out and we worked with both beef and sheep producers to better understand how they were coping with such extreme conditions. And through working with these knowledge networks, we've been learning a lot about drivers of impact, social and ecological vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. And at the time, we were calling this California's historic drought. A lot of folks that we talked to called it the drought of their generation. And so when we're working with these folks, there were 48 beef and sheep producers in this particular study. And we asked a lot of similar questions that we asked in that early 2011 male survey. And then also, dug in quite a bit more as well. And so first, we asked about those baseline practices, those proactive and reactive drought practices. And in terms of proactive practices, this just shows the top 3 practices by operation type. We, broke these into sectors of cow-calf operations, sheep operations, and multi-species grazing operations. And we found that, for each of these types, the most utilized proactive practices really revolved around, again, conserving forage and maintaining flexibility. Interestingly, we did observe an increase in proactive practice use across the board when we compared the 2011 and 2016 surveys. Not just increase of overall adoption rates for each of these practices, but we also saw, and I'm not showing it here, but we saw a broader range of proactive practices that folks were using within their operation. So a greater number of total proactive practices that folks had integrated within their operation, which might indicate, those underlying drought conditions that led into this 2012, into this historic drought, that they were a catalyst, for that proactive drought planning. Of course, then we also asked about those reactive drought practices. What are folks doing in response to the current drought or to this historic drought? And again, the top 3 most utilized practices by operation type, all again largely revolved around balancing forage supply and demand, and managing impact to that bottom line. Now, one of the things that really popped out for us when we were talking about these different drought management practices, both proactive and reactive, is that what came up was multi-species grazing for proactive drought management. Now, we found that multi-species grazing, it actually was the least used proactive drought management practice among folks that we interviewed. So only about 17%, very small group, were integrated proactive multi-species grazing as a drought management practice. But these folks, it was the highest ranked proactive practice based, on reported effectiveness. So these folks, it was a small group, but they really ranked it highly in terms of effectiveness for drought management. So this was really interesting. When we dug into the data, we found that these multi-species grazers, they had greater rates of adoption for several other drought management practices as well. So they had a significantly larger drought toolbox than their single species grazing counterparts. And as we found earlier, that was one of the key factors in enhancing adaptation capacity was, having that flexibility, having more tools available. So this suggests that there's potentially greater flexibility among the multi-species grazers than the single species grazers to cope with, these big extreme events like drought. And it makes sense, thinking about diversifying the portfolio. And so, these, modern day non-conventional strategies that, prioritize management flexibility, such as multi-species grazing, may offer potential transformational or climate smart opportunities. And this is something that is kind of a thread that started here and we're really interested in looking into more. We also asked about folks' perspectives on climate change and their interest in it. And so, we're seeing how planning horizons and perspectives may have been influenced by such a historic event. And so we posed several specific statements on climate change, which we borrowed from colleagues in Australia who worked with ranchers following their millennium drought. And when we posed these statements, we found that in general, these beef and sheep producers in California, they tended to disagree, so be kind of on this orange side here of the chart, with strong negative statements about the impact or importance of climate change. So they disagreed with statements like, generally, about, climate change is not an important consideration when developing options for my ranching business relative to other current issues. So they did see it as important, and they did believe that the future climate would be different than their past experience. We also found that they tended to agree with positive statements about their abilities to adapt and their interest in learning. This is key since we know the climate, environmental, and socioeconomic changes will, without a doubt, create conditions that really exceed any of our past or present experiences on rangelands. And it's important to see how these folks see the landscape, as Haley touched on already. This helps us understand, kind of interacting factors that might fuel transformational adaptation, for example, as opposed to maybe just incremental adaptation. And thinking about, how rangeland, and we're also been thinking about how rangeland social ecological systems are changing in these big ways that we've been talking about all morning. I also wanted to bring up how the people who are stewarding these lands might be changing or might be expanding and how we might be able to support that. In California, we have a whole new breed of ranchers, which we term first generation ranchers. And until now, there's been very limited research with this group. At best, they've been generalized as beginning farmers under mini policy and support programs. And so we've been expanding our focus to look at this new group. And so using those baseline 2011 male surveys with the California Cattlemen's Association, we're actually able to compare first generation and multi-generational ranchers looking across these important factors that we found drove individual adaptation capacity. And just kind of in a nutshell, we found that the first generational ranchers, they typically had more limited networks, less access to resources, and fewer adaptation strategies available to them than their multi-generational counterparts. And this potentially makes them more vulnerable to climate and environmental changes. And this group, this was all from that big California Cattlemen's male survey. So these folks were all members of the industry association. They generally had similar goals and demographics. And so kind of our next step or hypothesis was that, well, non-member first-generation ranchers, they're likely to have even stronger differences in social networks and on-ranch management practices and drought adaptation strategies because they have because they're potentially also different in terms of goals and demographics. And so work that was led by former graduate student Kate Munden Dixon. She went out and interviewed what we called, early career first-generation ranchers. And she talked with 40 folks. And what we found was that they were indeed a more diverse demographic. They were generally younger, kind of, more millennial generation, more often women, and more racially diverse than those multi-generational counterparts. They tended to have sheep and goat operations, so operating more on leased lands. So as you can imagine, creative land access is really key for them. We're also finding they're experimenting with different ways of doing things, but they're starting from scratch. So with this uncertain future, increased outreach and partnerships from support organizations really could be critical to helping this next generation succeed. So, the really importance of this is when we're thinking about policy and planning efforts, we really need to take into account the diversity of strategies developed and, to think about how we can reduce vulnerability across all types of operations and really be inclusive in thinking about that. So kind of relate all this to what are the current events now. Here in California, they're saying we're on the precipice of drought intensification. And much like the rest of the Southwest, we're stuck in a mega drought, which I just heard has actually been the driest in the last 1,200 years. And so, and folks on the ground, they see this. They've already been living it and they recognize it. As one of our interviewees stated, we expect drought every year now. I'm not sure I'd really call it a drought plan. It's just our normal way of ranching now. And as we all know, climate-related resource impacts will increasingly challenge ranching operations, as we continue to see these extremes increase. And so advancing transformational adaptation, is require a number of things. We're going to need, collaborative science and management partnerships, including local, state, and national policy and program support for proactive management solutions. And we need to think, like Haley said, we need to think more broadly about working across these boundaries, thinking beyond the ranch gate, and building cross-institutional partnerships to increase, capacity of not just, land managers, natural resource professionals, but us as scientists and our students. And so just to wrap up real quick, as a next steps for this, what we're doing in California is we have very recently launched a collaborative cooperative extension and USDA Climate Hub project with the overarching goal of developing kind of these multifaceted pathways to climate smart ag research and extension. And we're doing this through stakeholder needs assessments that will iteratively inform climate smart ag trainings for technical service providers, regional workshops for farmers and ranchers, and student education with extension service learning opportunities. And this is where, we're really bringing in that expert knowledge and on the ground experience to the classroom for that really important workforce development. And how are we gonna make this all work? Well, it's those really large multi-partner efforts, farmers and ranchers, commodity boards, NGOs, state and federal agencies, farm bureaus, and ag industry. And these partnerships can, I think, really get us beyond, that ranch gate and work toward transformational adaptation by addressing those very challenging, staying with the trouble, cross-scale sociological, political, and economic drivers. And that's what I have. Thank you, everyone. If anyone's interested, please contact me or watch these spaces for more information.